Hello everyone, today we continue our series about the Armada. We made last year a couple of videos explaining respectively the English and Spanish strategy. In the war, in the whole century before the same 1588, so the development of the Tudor Navy, the Spanish policy in the Mediterranean as well as in the Atlantic. As you know, I also recently started a series on the Americas, on the conquistadores. So today we look at the beginning of the hostilities, properly of the war that would lead during the years to 1588, to which in fact we stop today, then we'll go on another video. And the first engagements, not just in Europe but in Central America as well, and the general events leading up to the greater invasion. By the mid-80s of the 16th century, the tumultuous history of Tudor England was reaching a critical juncture, because, as we know, the Spanish conquest of England was really a primary goal for Philip II, and the Tudors were quite aware of this. Many international junctures were in fact bringing to this. The long and gradual descent into war with Spain specifically gained momentum as the English Secretary of State Walsingham's spies began reporting troubling developments from the Spanish ports, hinting at the potential for a significant naval expedition in the incoming years. New ships, constructions, and the assembly of munitions were obvious indicators. A notable success in intelligence was Walsingham's recruitment of Anthony Standen, a friend of the Tuscan ambassador in Madrid, who provided crucial information. Walsingham focused on preparing England for a potential conflict with Spain, overseeing significant renovations at Dover Harbor and advocating for a more assertive military stance. He also directed the English ambassador in Turkey, William Harborne, to try and convince the Ottoman Sultan to attack Spanish territories in the Mediterranean to divert Spanish military resources, although this effort was unsuccessful. Yet we will see how important the Moriscos revolt were in Spain, how essentially the Turkish privateers would terrorize the Mediterranean coastlines in order to cause the rebellion of these Muslim communities that still existed, in fact, in the Iberian world, would remain quite consistent issue until the mid 17th century. In May 1585, King Philip II of Spain ordered the seizure of several English ships docked in Spanish harbors. This was really the beginning of the concrete hostilities. The reason why the king did so was a Spanish crop failure. So the English ships' hold were filled with grain needed to alleviate this temporary crisis, and of course also signaling the general offensive at sea as the assertion of Spanish power. In response, Elizabeth I dispatched English troops, 5,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry. The English were still in the Tudor era, as you know, quite conservative in terms of the arms ratios compared to the Renaissance continental development. These troops were at the command at Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, to aid Philip's Dutch rebels. In fact, Dudley was to be, as he would, proclaimed Governor General of the Netherlands. This actually wouldn't be such a positive endeavor at the end of the day, because Leicester arrived in the Netherlands in December 1585 amid celebration. However, his authority was challenged by both the Queen's directives and local discontent, especially regarding his military actions and fiscal policies. his leadership faced difficulties due to inadequate funding, disputes with local leaders, and an unsuccessful campaign against the Duke of Parma, Alessandro Farnese, culminating in a pivotal loss at the Battle of Zutphen. We will see this better while studying the 80 Years' War. This was an important move, nevertheless, because of course, like the major Dutch sponsor against Spain was England, right? As we pointed out in other recent videos, including the ones on, say, leading up to the Armada, was of course the fact that had England been conquered, which had the navy been defeated by the Spanish, really a relatively easy task at that point, Protestantism in Europe, as we know, would have fundamentally ended, especially the Dutch revolt would have been quelled quite easily, and so basically Protestantism would have remained just perhaps in Scandinavia and some parts of northern Germany, but it would have not had such an easy future. Consider at this point, as we've seen also in the video about the French Wars of Religion, we will see now how the Guise were involved in this, anti-English policy, even though, of course, the attrition with the Spanish was also significant. In the video, in fact, about the French Wars of Religion, and in the alliance with Queen Mary of the Scots that would be killed, in fact, by Elizabeth in part also because of the actions against England, would happen exactly in these years, which the English were, of course, sensing the approach of the Spanish onslaught. Elizabeth also sent Sir Francis Drake, the famous privateer and, in fact, one of the greatest proponents of this great modernization of the English Navy, the huge potential. These were people who had invested enormous resources and had set for themselves major stakes, risking their lives, etc., but testing the limits of what was possible to achieve at sea. And Elizabeth was a rather conservative ruler, but she was also very intelligent, and as such she recognized, in spite of the meager resources of the crown, that these men were worth being funded. And in fact she sent Drake to raid Spanish coastal towns as a retaliation for the aforementioned seizure of the English cargoes in the Iberian Peninsula. After taking refuge in Vigo Bay along the Spanish coast for a week in September, after having raided, set on fire St. Vigo, where Drake's troops had successfully plundered far and wide, Drake set sail westward, so of course across the Atlantic, and his fleet consisted at this point of 21 ships and 8 small ocean-going pinnaces, which essentially are small boats, typically with sails and several oars forming part of the equipment of a warship or other large vessels. And of course, these naval forces were quite composite still at this point. Manned in total by around 1,000 sailors and with a landing force of 8 companies led by Christopher Carlyle, who was another English seaman. And following a raid on the Cape Verde Islands, Drake captured 2 of the most significant Spanish cities in the Caribbean, that is, Santo Domingo and Cartagena. The capture of Santiago in the Cape Verde Islands was a notable engagement of this Anglo-Spanish War, occurring between November the 11th and 28th, 1585. And led by Sir Francis Drake, the English expedition successfully captured the Portuguese-held port town of Cidade Velha. As you know, of course, the Spanish at this point controlled Portugal as well, and her colonies too, that eventually they failed to back up adequately, and the Portuguese maritime, the colonial empire had been essentially the first established historic, but also one that would decay pretty quickly. And following the capture of Santiago, the English forces sacked the town and subsequently attacked São Domingos and Praia before continuing their expedition in the Americas. The backdrop to these events was the declaration of war that we have seen occurring. Drake had set sail from Plymouth on September the 14th. First, as we've seen, attacking and ransoming Vigo in Spain before heading towards the Cape Verde Islands. Drake arrived off Santiago in early November, and planning his assault on Ciudad de Vella, initiated an attack under cover of darkness of November the 11th. His forces encountered minimal resistance, took control of the town, looted supplies, and captured several Portuguese slave ships. After holding the town and demanding ransom from its governor, he sent forces inland, looting and burning villages like São Domingos. On November the 28th, Drake targeted Praia, capturing it with little resistance, and subsequently razing its buildings except for the hospital before leaving the islands. Drake's actions aimed to send, of course, a clear message to the Spanish and Portuguese as part of the larger military engagement between the various countries. In December, Drake arrived at the uninhabited island of St. Kitts, where he sold supplies for his ailing crew. As we will see, he would lose lots of men, actually a monstrous proportion, to illness, as was sort of typical, of course, all the time, especially these very long journeys with limited supplies, especially the fresh ones. Now, he dispatched a reconnaissance squadron to the heavily fortified Spanish city of Santo Domingo on Hispaniola, led by Governor Cristobal de Ovalle, who commanded a well-armed garrison of nearly 1,500 men. On January 1st, 1586, Drake launched a surprise attack on Santo Domingo while a portion of his forces landed at an unguarded beach west of the city. Drake's main fleet engaged the city's defenses from the harbor. As the Spanish realized the threat, they attempted to organize a defense. However, English troops advanced through the jungle and overwhelmed the Spanish forces, which began to flee. The English managed to breach Santo Domingo's defenses, capturing the city with little significant resistance. Cristobal de Ovalle escaped, abandoning his wife, who became a hostage. The English then occupied the city, looted its treasures, and secured the harbor. Drake sought a ransom for the return of the city and the safety of his prisoners, initially demanding 1 million ducats. The negotiations were tense, marked by Drake's threats to destroy parts of the city to pressure the Spanish. Eventually, a ransom of 25,000 ducats was agreed upon, but tensions escalated after a Spanish delegation killed a messenger sent by Drake, leading him to execute several Spaniards in retaliation. After the murder was avenged, the ransom was finally paid by the end of January 1586, allowing Drake and his forces to depart. In February, Governor Don Pedro Fernandez de Busto of Cartagena, fearing an imminent attack after hearing of the sacking of Santo Domingo, prepared his city for the defense by evacuating non-combatants and gathering reinforcements. Cartagena was well protected by natural and artificial defenses, including a seawater-filled moat and fortified structures. The English fleet, led by Sir Francis Drake, approached Cartagena and started probing the defenses, but initial attempts to breach them were repelled. On the night of February the 9th, Drake's forces landed at La Caleta and successfully surprised Spanish sentries, allowing nearly 1,000 English soldiers and sailors to deploy effectively. Despite facing resistance from Spanish galleys and militia, the English managed to advance and overrun the Spanish defenses, entering the city and pursuing fleeing defenders. The battle resulted in light casualties on both sides, with English losses totaling 28 men, while the Spanish lost only 9. Drake captured approximately 250 Spanish, seized over 60 cannons, and controlled the city by February the 11th. He sought a ransom for the city, initially demanding 400,000 pesos, but after destruction and negotiation, agreed to a deal of 107,000, totaling about 250,000 pesos when including extorted payments from captives. Ultimately, with the ransom collected and disease spreading among his troops, Drake opted not to establish a permanent settlement, but instead abandoned the city after looting and taking valuable goods. The official plunder amounted to 107,000 pesos, as we've seen, with private looting reaching, however, approximately 357,000, culminating in a substantial overall gain for Drake's expedition. Thus, Drake returned to England. We are in July 1586, with some loot and, more importantly, 240 captured brass cannons that could increase the English naval firepower in view of the Spanish invasion. Drake had, however, still missed a major objective, actually the greater one of the expedition, is the Spanish treasure fleet. As we will see also in the following years, the main deal was to essentially prevent the enormous amount of precious metals that the Spanish were importing from the Americas to reach their destination and to hopefully end, of course, in English hands. This, of course, would have allowed the English extra time for preparing for the invasion, as the major wealth that such shipping contained could really alter the capacity of the Spanish to put together that massive expedition. Also, the raid did not yield significant commercial gains for Drake's merchant backers. Consider, again, the private backing in all this. Importantly enough, the English could not stop, for example, their own privates, their own companies, to sell weapons to the Spanish. In preparation of the Armada, some English men sold hundreds of guns to the Spanish, and this reflects, of course, like the power limits of early modern monarchies. In any case, the 1585-1586 raid served as a crucial strategic distraction that Philip of Spain would contemplate as he allocated military resources in the coming years. Because, of course, the Spanish were impressed by such English capacities, and the moral and strategic quantities varied importantly, as, of course, the Spaniards realized that the English needed to be checked. Otherwise, their shipping could be significantly threatened, and Spain as well could even be temporarily severed from the American context. As we were pointing out before, Drake suffered the loss of approximately 750 men, mainly to disease, out of a total force of just over 2,000, essentially by the attack on Cartagena. The English had something like 1,800 men, and so many were lost of them, almost a half. In the meanwhile, Drake disagreed with the other major privateer, naval commander of the era, and as well as his cousin, by the way, Oakins, regarding the optimal manning ratios needed to prevent such attrition, which naturally was not much of a technical issue, but a political one, because all these expeditions required funding. And of course, the English command and court was complicated. There were opponents, of course, of such activities. Elizabeth actually understood how relevant they were, but she was legitimately a bit tight-fisted, because each and every one of them was a great expanse with huge risks, and so until things happened, nobody could really know where that money was well spent. Despite losing a third of his overcrowded contingent, because that had been part of the reason of such losses, that, however, also had accomplished the conquest of those Spanish and Portuguese colonies, a figure that should have reinforced Hogan's argument, Drake remained unconvinced, as demonstrated by his future expeditions that actually would prove the correctness of his insight. Elizabeth hoped to dissuade a major Spanish attack on England by highlighting the vulnerabilities of Spain's distant territories to raids like those conducted by Drake. The age of explorations was full in, but the means of communication between the Old World and the Indies were objectively still very primitive and strainable by such attacks, which constituted definitely the Schwerpunkt in the war with England. However, this strategy paradoxically had an opposite effect on Philip, that was actually a pretty stubborn, decisive, and even impositive ruler, as you know. And despite delaying the departure of his American treasure fleet in early 1586 to avoid Drake, in fact, somehow managed to secure resources to continue his invasion preparations. Of course, the Spanish possessions across the world were pretty big. There were ways to squeeze resources from here and there. Experimental Spanish galleasses were, for example, built in Naples, while further construction and repairs were underway in all Spanish and Portuguese ports. Don't underestimate the Portuguese contribution to the Armada, as well as the allied Genoese one. Across Europe, Spanish agents scored markets for cannons and munitions. Between 1586 and 1587, guns for the Armada, as we were pointing out before, were illicitly acquired from English manufacturer via Naples, and one iron master in Sussex sold 100 cannons to the Spanish. Merchants from Bristol supplied 9 shiploads of culverins, so long-range artillery cast from the Forest of Dean, along with powder, muskets, and shot. As we're already pointing out before, this tells you how incredibly complicated being an early modern ruler really was, how permeable the various countries and states were. In light of such Spanish activity, it would have, of course, been prudent for the English to follow up on Drake's raid with another significant transoceanic expedition later in 1586. That was really the most effective strategy, as much as at least the means to procure such armament could be decreased through an effective isolation of Spain from the Indies. However, Elizabeth's limitations as a wartime leader, compounded by her chief advisor, William Cecil Baron Burghley's inability to compensate for her shortcomings, became glaringly apparent in the indecision exhibited for the remainder of that year. Every single choice, of course, equated to neglect some aspects of government by providing resources to another element of the same, and internal issues were quite pressing. As you know, Elizabeth's assassination attempts were frequent during her reign. Hawkins was prepared that summer with a squadron of 18 ships and pinnaces, 5 of which were the Queen's own vessels, which tells you how also individually committed Elizabeth was. Hawkins intended to patrol the Iberian coast and establish a blockade before crossing the Atlantic to strike at Spain's colonies in the Americas again. Naturally, the resources were very limited, not just stretched, in order to achieve such a feat. But indeed, right, creating chaos along the Spanish coastline and obliging Spain to, in fact, distract some resources just to cope with that and stabilize, in fact, the same ports that would have hosted the Armada for the invasion of England, was a good idea. Though Hawkins finally received permission to set sail, where in August, Elizabeth restricted him to a patrol in the Channel. Fearing, this time she was right, she was really considered in all this, a cross-channel invasion attempt by the French Catholic Duke of Guise, France's Catholic champion, we should say, the one that would be eventually assassinated by Henry III, to no avail, by the way. This happening in conjunction with the Babington plot to assassinate the same Elizabeth and replace her with Mary, Queen of the Scots. Now, the Babington plot is important for many reasons, because this put Elizabeth in a very difficult situation regarding the prison of Mary, who was also her relative. By the way, as you know, she was the mom of James I. Her son was already meant, in fact, to succeed Elizabeth, that had no children, she wasn't married, etc. The plot was a conspiracy occurring, in fact, in 1586 to assassinate Elizabeth and place her Catholic cousin, Mary, Queen of the Scots, on the throne. The scheme involved hopes of a Spanish invasion backed by the Catholic League in France, that was increasingly opposed also to the rule of the king, tried compromise with the Protestants, to restore Catholicism in England. The French and the Spanish did not like each other very much. Not even the same Catholic factions liked one another, meaning that the Catholic Spanish at some point would back the more, say, compromising line, or even the Protestant, the Huguenot one in France, fearing some, for example, involvement in the Netherlands, with the Guise wanted to support the Dutch, paradoxically, like wiping out the Spanish and attempting just eventually to deal with the Protestants, and hopefully, in fact, receiving the same Huguenot support in the enterprise. Now, the plot was uncovered by Sir Francis Walsingham, as we've seen, Elizabeth's spy master, who used it to entrap Mary, who had been imprisoned at this point for 19 years. The main conspirators included Anthony Babington, hence the name, and the Jesuit priest John Bayard, with double agents like Robert Polley, Gilbert Giffard, working for Walsingham himself. In July 1586, a letter from Mary was decoded, in which she sanctioned the assassination of Elizabeth and expressed desperation for rescue. Despite Mary's denials, evidence gathered during her subsequent trial, including confessions from her secretaries, implicated her as an active participant. Mary was imprisoned after seeking Elizabeth's protection following her forced abdication in Scotland. Numerous plots targeting Elizabeth, encouraged by the Pope and European Catholic leaders, led to Mary's long-term confinement. In 1584, a bond of association was established, holding any potential successors to Elizabeth accountable for the plots against her, paving the way for Mary's execution if implicated. Walsingham orchestrated a new communication method to discreetly monitor messages between Mary and her supporters, eventually leading to Mary's authorization of Elizabeth's assassination. Once the plot was revealed, several conspirators were arrested and Mary was tried without legal counsel. She was convicted of treason and executed on February 8, 1587, marking a significant event, of course, in the conflict between Protestant England and Catholic factions. Elizabeth was actually displeased by such bloodshed. She was mostly forced into this by the general circumstance that is yet another indicator of how intense the threat of the invasion of England really was at this point, not just from Spain. Consider that, for example, in the Netherlands, together with the Dutch revolt, of course, it was always the Duke of Parma that, as we will see better also in the next videos, was participating actively in the support of the Armada and had actually even come up with a plan to invade England just with barges fundamentally that could have actually succeeded in landing Habsburgic forces into the island. Now, by September 1586, the threat of invasion, so with the plot discovered and everything, had fundamentally receded. Hawkins was thus authorized to head toward Spain as planned. However, his fleet had been at sea too long, and he returned without having achieved significant results, having missed the returned convoys of the Portuguese East Indiamen and the American Silver Fleet of 1586. These were again the main objectives in this mission too, and they of course hadn't been achieved yet again. Of course, the English naval resources, in fact, were that limited. The Spanish were formidable foes, and in spite of the greater quality of English forces, the capacity to operate against such a powerful enemy were, of course, quite reduced. Hawkins' unsuccessful expedition in 1586 must have been a significant setback for all the proponents of that innovative offensive naval strategy, which sought to deter the Spanish Armada through continuous aggressive operations along the Spanish coastline. Hawkins had been quite the banner figure of this policy. Nevertheless, Queen Elizabeth was somehow persuaded to send, this time, Drake back into action the following year. By 1587, in fact, preparations for a Spanish invasion were sufficiently advanced to suggest that the Armada would set sail that very year. As we know, of course, it wouldn't happen, but the year after. In any case, they were really close to that. Drake's mission was to disrupt, of course, such naval force as it was being gathered, similar to what Lord Admiral Lille, we've seen it in the first videos, had attempted, for example, against the French fleet in the Seine in 1545, and to prevent its departure altogether. So from, as we'll see it now, the English plan by this point was delaying the Armada. They knew how threatening that was. Had they been defeated at sea, there was practically nothing that they could do against the Spanish land forces. So Drake executed his mission with actually remarkable skill, relying on his instinct, audacity, and a streak, of course, of extraordinary, of good fortune. Nobody could really tell how this thing would go. The situation actually appeared desperate because of these previous failures in particular, and so the English impossibility to stop the Armada, but even just settling on delaying it, without fortune, even the greatest of commanders can't win. By definition, by tradition, we've seen it many times. So Drake departed on April the 12th, 1587, commanding a fleet of 16 warships, including 4 Royal Naval galleons and additional merchant ships funded by London merchants with profits split between them and the Queen, that was thus very personally involved, as we've seen, to back these privateers, and 7 pinnaces. A counter command from the Queen advising against hostilities did not reach Drake due to a storm. The fleet encountered information about a large Spanish war fleet in Cadiz, leading to a raid on the port from April the 19th to May the 1st. Despite fierce engagement, the English destroyed or captured numerous Spanish vessels, significantly weakening their naval capabilities. He reached the port of Cadiz a couple of weeks later and boldly entered the harbor with his entire fleet. So you have 10 Spanish galleys, which would typically perform best in the confined waters of the harbor, being easily driven off by the English artillery, that, as we will see, in fact, also during the Armada clashes around Britain, would really be a major deal to confront. Drake spent 2 days wreaking havoc in the harbor, burning 31 ships and capturing 6 more. He then evaded encirclement by Spanish artillery that was being positioned against him and moved on to occupy Cape St. Vincent. For the next 2 months, Drake's ships patrolled the coastline, disrupting Spanish maritime traffic. On his return journey via the Azores, he capped off his exploit by seizing a valuable Portuguese treasure ship, the San Felipe, which had a cargo worth £114,000. So this was a major success instead. And finally, the impact of Drake's actions on the Spanish effort was really relevant. Admiral Santa Cruz pursued Drake to the Azores with all available ships and did not return with incoming treasure convoys until October 1587. Between Cadiz and the Azores, Drake's fleet had attacked shipping along the coast of Spain and Portugal. It even landed troops at Lagos, capturing the fortresses there. There were skirmishes with the Spanish-Portuguese forces near Lisbon. Right, that's when eventually the South Felipe had occurred in the Azores. And by that time, crew exhaustion and the losses incurred at Cadiz had necessitated a postponement of the invasion of England until 1588. It was a clamorous success. By the end of the expedition, over 100 Spanish ships had been lost, delaying Spain's plans for an invasion of England for more than a year. Drake's actions along the Spanish coast not only humiliated King Philip II, but also inspired Spain's enemies. Or importantly, think about having this enormous empire and all that entails in terms of attrition for all the possible competitors, all the possible counters that can occur, while showcasing the potential of English naval power as well, that would have been awaiting just from their very then for the Spanish onslaught. So even though being minor in comparison and just to an extent, so the Spanish one could have really inflicted devastating losses as it would happen. Drake warned Elizabeth to prepare for future Spanish aggression because he knew, obviously, that the Spanish were that strong to be able to challenge them at sea and potentially breaking them. In the light of such striking success, during the winter of 1587-1588, debates over the naval strategy that England had to maintain continued among various leaders. The competing demands on Queen Elizabeth's limited resources were evident in her indecision around fleet mobilization. Where would this go? In other words, it was politically necessary to do such a detrimental thing like leaving the initiative to the Spanish, at least considering that these raids alone, even if continued, as of course the Queen was favorable to, would have not, however, prevented the invasion per se. At least, of course, other things could happen in the international landscape. However, it was pretty clear that Philip II has set his mind on the conquest of England. After Drake returned home, we are in June of 1587, his fleet had, by the way, been demobilized. So royal support had partially, and of course the part of the private one being with Rome, because maintaining ships costs a lot, and so this was not really kidding. However, by October 1587, Drake's forces were remobilized in the anticipation of a potential late autumn invasion, because of course there was a lag in time for preparing the forces, and if you were just awaiting for news of the Armada setting sail from Spain, it would have been a bit too late without further precautions. In December, Lord Admiral Howard of Effingham was put on alert. For this reason, Drake became his vice admiral, commanding an independent squadron based in Plymouth. In January 1588, the fleet was partially demobilized in an effort to conserve funds, and due to concerns about outbreaks of disease among the crews that were just being stationed there, and thus increasing the risks for epidemic. Only from this frenetic back and forth you understand how tense the situation was, and how rapidly things could really escalate. In January and February 1588, Hawkins vigorously advocated for a blockade strategy. He essentially continued in his proposal of the harassment of the Spanish coastline, this time, however, with a pretty sizable force of a squadron of 6 galleons and 6 pinnaces, fully manned and provisioned, essentially lasting for 4 months, which was unprecedented. With a total of around 800 men in the crews, the estimated monthly cost for wages and provisions was £2,730, which was a relatively minor expense that could easily be offset by the potential profits for capturing a few Spanish ships. The problem was whether this would actually be sustainable over time, and if that goals would have been scored. Like after 4 months, the blockading squadron would be relieved by another one of similar size. And so Hawkins' vision was the one of a continuous blockade using alternating squadrons, and actually it was incredibly bold for the time. It was underpinned by his belief that a war could be won through such means alone. In fact, both Hawkins and Drake were convinced that a blockade could cripple the Spanish monarchy by severing its access to gold and silver from the Americas entirely. The problem with this was, however, the actual capacity to maintain the block. Right? The strategy of long-range naval blockade was unprecedented, untested, so nobody really knew whether funding this enterprise rather than doing something more productive, even just to increase other forms of naval operation, would have been, in fact, positive. Elizabeth was pretty risk averse to begin with, and so she could actually as reasonably question whether the ship's signaling methods, communications, naval discipline, and hygiene, considering also the previous issues during even the relatively successful expeditions of Drake, were up to such a demanding task. It was also a pretty risky one, right? The same admirals could be lost, whether or not. Neither Drake in 1585, 86, nor Hawkins later in the latter year had successfully intercepted a treasure fleet from the Americas, for example. So had it all been worth it? Like, morally, yes. The fact that there were such debates over it definitely proved the success that those expeditions had overall, especially what kind of damage had inflicted beyond the strictly military one on Spain. That also was, especially in the last Drake's expedition, quite important. Moreover, however, neither of the two commanders had managed to stay at sea off the Spanish coast in a state of effective combat readiness for as long as 3 months. So 4 months were really unprecedented. Nobody really had known how quickly the system could simply decay after, even before that date. Hawkins had theorized that a squadron of the ones proposed would have had an operational limit of 6 months even. This was really a very optimistic idea. The performance in practice would fall short of that consistently. So that link, that blockade, that was all what, by the way, they could hope to achieve, and still in a time in which you couldn't really intercept every single vessel, so it was practically like a real hazard. It's not really before the Victorian era that you can control like a major stretch of sea so capillarly. So things seemed sort of way more optimistic than anything. Of course, this would have contributed to the detriment of Spain. Just it would have likely not succeeded. It would have been too stretched. It would have actually saved further time that could have been precious, but was not really like an end game. It would present itself only off England eventually. Additionally, Hawkins' proposal to rely only on only 6 galleons for the main battle line of the blockading squadron seemed really a serious underestimation of the forces required for an effective blockade operation. The Spanish Navy was strong. As we've seen, it included some very fine navies from the rest of Europe. If the blockading squadrons needed to be larger, potentially 16, up to 16 major ships, as Drake had taken to Cadiz, by the way, in 1587, and required rotation every 2 to 3 months, because this would have also increased the time which they really needed to be rotated, because the system would have sort of decayed more quickly, instead of every 4. The strain on the actually available English shipping and the St. Queen's financial resources could have been considerable. At that point, it was not sustainable, just like with a lighter force initially contemplated. So at that point, England would have resented this. There would have not been a general support even by the privates, which is essentially what happened. As we will see, it is evident also that the Spanish onslaught was just much more solidly, planned, prepared, and in fact readier to start than it even seemed to some extent. It is likely that Hawkins' visionary plans for a distant blockade exceeded both his sovereign's resources and the naval technology available at the time. So that we shouldn't probably think too much about this scenario. It's not like the English wouldn't eventually expand or retaliate also with an armada of their own against Spain after 1588. We will see it at some point. It is rather the validity of the the blockade that was the only thing that could justify such expense, such operation. And how things were played out there were in a sense riskier, but they were possibly even allowing the English for a better defense, a better preparation. Had they exhausted themselves into this continuous blockade, admittedly, would it just lasted for so long? I mean, had it been successful, yes, it could have caused considerable damage, but I don't think it, especially at this point, by the end of 1587, beginning of 1588, things could have simply been stopped or delayed, or if so, it's likely that this blockading force would have outstretched, could have even suffered reversals that would have placed the same England in a much riskier situation later. So it's of course it would have gotten to some kind of showdown, but they taking out the entire Spanish forces even to no consequence for your own, they could still essentially maintain that balance that would eventually bring the English to leave the initiative to the enemy and accept the Armada to reach Britain, is another story. And so we'll see that the same Spanish plan had some significant, say, not just faults in itself. It's, of course, there are some aspects that could be better, etc., but were dictated by the circumstances. But I mean, the Spanish themselves had logistically pretty immense issues, such as the fact that this fleet was literally to leave from the same Spain. We've seen it. It's not like they were going to stop, I don't know, in the Netherlands or whatever. So it was actually showing how powerful the same Spanish availability of resources was. And so Hawkins' plan was not so... it was a bit too theoretical in nature. Drake had showed that he could, say, achieve more and better, more practical ways, but at the same time there was something more concrete regarding the same idea of defending Britain from its same shores than anything else. It was a bit too... again, it would have occurred in future naval warfare, which was definitely heading toward that direction. Just it was practically unfeasible for this time being, to the extent at least that could have been useful for the English in this specific circumstance. So as you understand, there is really a lot to say about this topic, because not only it would come to define say modern European history, but because indeed it exemplifies the difficulties, the unpredictability, and the subordination of the military instrument to politics, which even is also like the most important background of this all, because today we just focus on the strictly naval issue, but really lots of things, as we've seen just with the plot against Elizabeth, in fact, French attempt to invade England, the fact that Scotland was looming out there, and in fact during the same Spanish invasion, that was the point. Like there was a thought also, of course, of simply landing in Scotland for some general purpose in all of this. Now, the difficulty in maintaining all this in a balanced fashion, for which you have to consider how all these factors are influencing the wall as much as they are influenced by the wall in turn, is the most difficult thing. There isn't really the major game changer. The odds were particularly balanced, and the general sense of this coming to very different outcomes, the ones that we know historically, is actually pretty concrete. That's also why it's so interesting to look at that. I'm glad, as some of you observed, that we're expanding more into early modern warfare. It is really relevant for the channel because not just I already made so much about modern warfare, but because it's a different way of looking at it compared to what, in fact, we have dealt with the same era normally. Essentially, I decided to stop to start simply a manualistic background for the military history of it. I don't know how much it works, but it is an attempt. It is a way. We could resume that as well. Just, of course, there are particular challenges to all of this because I noticed that, of course, like sometimes even the military historical background is difficult to grasp if you don't have like broader political historical background in the world. Like, it can be even more challenging. This is valid also for me because, of course, I learn along the way in part. So this is still, however, a valuable exercise, and that's how also military history works. Like, until you try, you don't really know how it's going to go. You really don't know. But it's also the only way for eventually capitalizing upon it, opening that path, which, if, of course, like it is open most of the times because it's really ready to be, and so everything comes gradually. And we should actually talk more about naval warfare, so the development of the Royal Navy. That's always actually a major topic we've never really too much addressed, aside from this 16th century English strategy leading up to the Armada's times. We'll have to do this further. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.